Every time you look at a $10 bill, check your investment portfolio, or hear a news report about the national debt ceiling, you are interacting with a blueprint drawn up over 2 centuries ago. The modern American financial machine, with its massive sovereign debt, centralized banking power, and liquid capital markets, feels like a permanent, unchangeable law of nature. But this architecture was not inevitable. It was engineered by a single, polarizing figure who believed that a nation's survival required binding its citizens and its wealthiest elites directly to its balance sheet. Alexander Hamilton, an orphaned immigrant from the Caribbean, became the architect of a system designed to weaponize debt. How did a man born into absolute obscurity convince a skeptical, newly formed republic to embrace the very centralized financial power they had just fought a bitter war to escape? To understand the financial reality you live in today, you have to understand the absolute economic chaos of the era before Hamilton's system took hold. In the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War, the United States was not a unified economic powerhouse. It was a fragmented, bankrupt collection of 13 squabbling economies. There was no standard national currency, no functional system of taxation, and zero international credit. The newly independent states were drowning in wartime obligations, and the federal government was entirely powerless to manage the fallout. Hamilton's understanding of money did not come from aristocratic privilege, inherited land, or academic theory. It was forged in the brutal, mercantile economy of St. Croix. Working as a young clerk trading currencies, commodities, and ship manifests in the West Indies, he learned early that credit was the absolute lifeblood of power. He saw firsthand that without a reliable system of debt, contract enforcement, and standardized exchange, societies remain vulnerable to collapse or foreign domination. When he arrived in New York on the eve of the American Revolution, he brought this ruthless, pragmatic understanding of global capital with him. During the war, while serving as George Washington's indispensable aide-de-camp, Hamilton witnessed a different, more dangerous kind of bankruptcy. The Continental Army was starving and freezing. This was not for a lack of food or resources on the continent, but for lack of a functioning central government that could actually pay for those resources. The Continental Congress had no constitutional power to tax the population. Instead, they printed rapidly depreciating paper currency and relied on voluntary financial contributions from the individual states. Those contributions almost never arrived. Hamilton realized a terrifying truth as he watched the army nearly dissolve over unpaid wages. Military victory without financial sovereignty was merely a delayed death sentence. A nation that could not borrow money reliably, could not defend itself, build infrastructure, or survive the geopolitical threats of the 18th century. While other founding figures fought for abstract philosophical ideals of liberty and state sovereignty, Hamilton was obsessing over the cold mechanics of national credit. He began to formulate a radical theory. He understood that a government's actual power is measured not by the soaring rhetoric of its founding documents, but by the confidence of its creditors. If the wealthy merchants, foreign powers, and domestic elites held the debt of the new national government, they would be financially chained to its survival. If the nation failed, their fortunes would vanish. Therefore, a national debt, managed correctly, would not be a fatal weakness or a burden. It would be the ultimate institutional glue, forcing a fragile, divided union to hold together simply because it was too expensive to let it fail. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 secured American independence on paper, but it exposed a catastrophic financial reality. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government possessed no authority to levy taxes. It could only politely request funds from the 13 states to pay off the massive foreign and domestic loans incurred during the war. Unsurprisingly, the states largely ignored these requests, preferring to manage their own localized economic crises. The consequence of this structural impotence became violently clear in the winter of 1786. In western Massachusetts, thousands of desperate, indebted farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans who had been paid in worthless continental currency, faced the seizure of their lands. Led by Daniel Shays, they took up arms against the state government. Shays' rebellion sent a shockwave of terror through the American elite, proving exactly what Hamilton had long warned. Without a robust central financial apparatus, the Republic would fracture into anarchy and mob rule. This crisis catalyzed the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. Hamilton arrived with a singular, relentless focus, demanding a centralized national government with the absolute power to tax and regulate commerce. While he did not get the near-monarchical executive branch he proposed, the final document contained the very mechanism he required. Article 1, Section 8 of the new Constitution explicitly granted Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts, specifically to pay the debts of the United States. When George Washington assumed the presidency in 1789, he appointed the 34-year-old Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton inherited a financial wasteland. The United States owed millions to foreign powers like France and the Netherlands, millions more to domestic creditors, and the individual states held their own massive, unpayable war debts. American credit was virtually non-existent on the global stage, and the nation's debt certificates traded for pennies on the dollar among cynical speculators. Hamilton responded by drafting one of the most consequential documents in American economic history. In January 1790, he delivered his first report on the public credit to Congress. He did not propose simply paying off the debt as quickly as possible, which was the conventional wisdom of his agrarian opponents. Instead, he proposed restructuring it into a permanent, funded national debt. The mechanical core of his plan was deeply controversial. Hamilton demanded that the federal government assume the entirety of the state debts, rolling them into one massive federal obligation. By consolidating the debt, he was intentionally consolidating political power. If wealthy citizens across all 13 states suddenly held bonds issued by the federal government, their personal fortunes would be completely dependent on the survival and taxation power of that central government. He was engineering a system where the wealthiest and most influential men in the country would wake up every morning praying for the success of the federal treasury. Furthermore, Hamilton insisted that the current holders of the debt certificates be paid at face value. This enraged critics like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who pointed out that predatory speculators had bought these certificates from desperate war veterans for a fraction of their worth. Hamilton was unsympathetic to the plight of the original holders. His objective was not moral justice or wealth redistribution. His objective was establishing the absolute sanctity of American financial contracts. He understood that global capital markets operate on predictable rules, and if the new government altered contracts retroactively based on moral sentiment, it would never secure the trust of international bankers. To build the machine he envisioned, the speculators had to win, and the federal government had to become the sole, undisputed financial center of the continent. The battle over Hamilton's plan to assume state debts threatened to tear the fragile republic apart before it had even truly begun. James Madison, representing the agrarian interests of Virginia, blocked the Assumption Bill in the House of Representatives in the spring of 1790. Virginia had already paid off the majority of its wartime debt and had no desire to be taxed by a central government to bail out heavily indebted northern states like Massachusetts. The political gridlock was absolute, and the threat of Southern secession became a quiet but persistent undercurrent in the capital of New York. The impasse was broken in June 1790 through one of the most famous closed-door negotiations in political history. Thomas Jefferson, recently returned from France to serve as Secretary of State, hosted a private dinner at his residence on Maiden Lane. There, Hamilton and Madison struck a ruthless, pragmatic bargain. Madison agreed to allow the federal assumption of state debts to pass Congress. In exchange, Hamilton agreed to use his political influence to move the permanent capital of the United States out of the northern financial centers and into a swampy, agrarian district along the Potomac River, bordering Virginia. The Southerners secured physical proximity to political power, but Hamilton secured the actual machinery of power. The Residence Act and the Funding Act both passed in July 1790. Hamilton had his consolidated national debt, but a consolidated debt was only the first pillar of the architecture. To manage this massive financial ledger, collect revenues, and facilitate commerce, Hamilton knew the government required a central financial institution. In December 1790, he delivered his Report on a National Bank to Congress, calling for the charter of the Bank of the United States. This was an unprecedented proposition. The bank would be a public-private partnership capitalized at $10 million, with the federal government owning 20% of the shares and private investors holding the rest. The mechanics of this bank were designed to turn the national debt into a powerful economic engine. Private investors could purchase bank shares using the newly issued federal debt certificates. The bank would then issue paper currency backed by these government bonds. Suddenly, the debt was not a dead weight. It was transformed into liquid capital that could flow through the economy, funding commercial expansion, shipbuilding, and industrial development. This proposal triggered a constitutional crisis. Jefferson and Madison argued vehemently that the Constitution nowhere granted the federal government the authority to charter a corporation. They championed strict constructionism, fearing that if the government could claim unwritten powers in the name of financial expediency, there would be no limit to federal tyranny. Hamilton countered with a brilliant legal maneuver, formulating the doctrine of implied powers. He argued that the Constitution's necessary and proper clause granted the government the authority to use any logical means to execute its explicitly granted powers, such as collecting taxes and borrowing money. In February 1791, George Washington sided with Hamilton and signed the bank bill into law. The core financial architecture was now in place. However, designing a debt machine in Philadelphia was entirely different from extracting the revenue required to run it. To pay the interest on the massive, newly funded national debt, the federal government needed hard currency. Import tariffs were insufficient. Consequently, at Hamilton's urging, Congress passed the excise whiskey tax in March 1791. It was the first tax imposed by the new national government on a domestically produced product. For the wealthy merchants of the East Coast, the tax was a minor inconvenience, but for the frontier farmers of western Pennsylvania, it was an existential threat. Separated from eastern markets by the formidable Appalachian Mountains, these farmers could not transport bulky grain overland without it rotting. Their only viable economic strategy was distilling their surplus grain into whiskey, which was easily transportable and highly valuable. In the cash-poor western frontier, whiskey was not just a beverage, it was the primary medium of exchange. It was currency. Hamilton's tax fundamentally criminalized their economic survival. It mandated that farmers pay the tax in hard currency, which they simply did not possess. Furthermore, the tax structure inherently favored large Eastern distillers who paid a flat fee, while penalizing small Western farmers who were taxed by the gallon. The Westerners viewed this not as a legitimate revenue measure, but as a predatory wealth transfer designed to extract their labor to pay the interest of Eastern speculators who held the national debt. Resistance was immediate and violent. Tax collectors were ambushed, tarred, and feathered. Homes were burned. By the summer of 1794, the resistance had escalated into a full-scale armed insurrection known as the Whiskey Rebellion, with thousands of armed militiamen gathering near Pittsburgh. For Hamilton, this was not merely a localized riot. It was the ultimate stress test of his entire financial and political system. If citizens could violently refuse to pay the taxes that serviced the national debt, international creditors would instantly lose faith in the American government. The debt would collapse, and the nation would fracture. Hamilton saw an opportunity to demonstrate the absolute supremacy of federal power. He convinced President Washington that the rebellion had to be crushed with overwhelming, undeniable force. In October 1794, Washington and Hamilton rode out at the head of a federalized militia force of nearly 13,000 men, an army larger than the one Washington had commanded at the Battle of Yorktown. The sheer scale of the military response shattered the rebellion before a major battle could even be fought. The insurrectionists dispersed, leaders were arrested, and federal authority was cemented. Hamilton had proven that the United States government would deploy military force against its own citizens to guarantee the revenues that secured its financial obligations. The architecture of American sovereign debt was now backed by bayonets. By the time Alexander Hamilton stepped down as Secretary of the Treasury in 1795, the transformation was absolute. In less than 6 years, he had engineered a financial miracle out of a bankrupt Confederacy. American credit was now among the most secure in the world. Foreign capital poured into the newly formed United States, funding a rapid expansion of trade, infrastructure, and industrial capacity. The blueprint was complete. The federal government possessed the authority to tax, a central bank to manage its capital, and a consolidated national debt that bound the wealthiest citizens to the survival of the state. Hamilton had won the ideological war, but the mechanics of his victory would ultimately destroy him politically and personally. His relentless drive to centralize power had created bitter, powerful enemies. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison organized the Democratic-Republican Party specifically to dismantle Hamilton's financial architecture, framing him as a crypto-monarchist who had sold the republic to corrupt Eastern bankers. Hamilton's own hubris provided his enemies with the ammunition they needed. The revelation of his extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds and his subsequent publication of a painfully detailed pamphlet defending his public integrity at the cost of his private honor shattered his political viability. His influence waned as he returned to private law practice in New York, continuing to guide Federalist policy from the shadows, but increasingly alienated from the levers of direct power. This bitter, escalating partisan warfare culminated on the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, in July 1804, where Vice President Aaron Burr fatally shot Hamilton in a duel. Hamilton died heavily in debt, a brutal irony for the man who had authored The Wealth of a Nation. But the true revelation of Hamilton's genius was that his system did not require his survival to function. When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, he vowed to tear down the Hamiltonian machine, eliminate internal taxes, and pay off the national debt. Yet when presented with the opportunity to double the size of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Jefferson faced a stark reality. He did not have the cash. To secure the continent for his agrarian empire, Jefferson was forced to utilize the exact financial instruments Hamilton had created. The United States government issued $15 million in sovereign bonds to finance the purchase, utilizing the very international credit markets and central banking mechanisms that Jefferson had spent a decade denouncing. The Hamiltonian architecture proved inescapable. The machine was too useful, too powerful, and too deeply entrenched to be destroyed, even by its fiercest critics. The consequences of this victory echo through every transaction in the modern American economy. The winners were the centralizers, the financial markets, and the vision of a unified, industrialized superpower. The losers were those who believed independence meant freedom from the influence of distant bankers and federal tax collectors. The tension between Main Street and Wall Street, between local autonomy and federal financial supremacy, was permanently hardwired into the Republic during those first crucial years. Today, when the Treasury Department auctions billions of dollars in bonds to global investors, it is operating Hamilton's machinery. When the Federal Reserve, the direct institutional descendant of the First Bank of the United States, adjusts interest rates to manage liquidity, it is exercising the centralized financial authority Hamilton fought to establish. The staggering multi-trillion-dollar national debt is not a modern accident. It is the ultimate realization of a system designed to ensure that the fate of global capital and the fate of the American government are permanently, inextricably linked. Looking at the sheer scale of modern sovereign debt, does a nation require a centralized financial machine to survive on the global stage? Or did the founders trade political liberty for economic security? The systems that govern our wealth, our obligations, and our freedom were not handed down by nature. They were fiercely debated, ruthlessly implemented, and designed by individuals who understood that controlling the ledger meant controlling the future. If you want to understand the hidden architecture of the modern world and the historical forces that continue to shape your daily life, subscribe to our channel as we continue to investigate the origins of the systems you live under.